Tales from the Old Forest. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 5. Feel the fear and do it anyway. Plentyn woke with the dawn. This is one of those things that's gone out of fashion in a modern age of electric lighting and late-night doom-scrolling, but trust me when I tell you, it really is quite a lovely experience once in a while. I'm not necessarily suggesting you take it up as a daily lifestyle. For many of us, the morning is a most unwelcome interruption to that rare moment of peace, bringing with it work or school or the crushing guilt that comes from realizing you'll have to make yet another excuse not to go to the gym. However, every now and then, it really is the most magical thing to come awake with nature. To see the pink-hued sky as the sun crests the horizon, to hear the dawn chorus, to catch sight of the last nocturnal creatures making their way home to bed. This was the moment Plentyn had now as he lifted his head, brushed his hood back, and looked out through the trees. Unusually, he was fully awake, with none of his normal morning bleariness. Red was sprawled out on his chest, her little arms and legs flared wide like a starfish. To his right, Hopper's eyes were still closed peacefully, though his legs kicked and twitched idly from time to time. Grandma was nowhere to be seen, but then this hardly surprised him. The old woman didn't really seem to need sleep. "I sleeps when the forest sleeps," she had told him once. But as anyone who's ever been to any type of forest will tell you, forests don't sleep. The sun may rise and fall over the trees, but that just means a different class of creature comes out to populate the woodland. Forests don't sleep, and neither, it seemed, did Grandma. Where she was now he had no idea, but if he were to make a guess, she was probably off having a conversation with a tree, or the river, or some nocturnal bird or beast. From the corner of his eye, Plentyn saw a hedgehog chuffing along to itself as it made its way back to its nest, and Plentyn wondered whether it was returning from a chat with Grandma. He was half tempted to try and speak to it himself, but seeing how the hedgehog tottered and doddered about, he thought better of it. Clearly the creature was tired enough and in need of sleep. Sliding his hand carefully under Red, he lifted her gently and laid her down on the woolen cloak he'd been using as a bedroll, before rising silently and ghosting away into the trees. He may not have lived in the forest for long, but one of the first things Grandma had taught him was how to move quietly through the woodland, and not to go about stomping and clomping those great feet of yours like a demented shire horse, as she put it. Putting those skills to use, Plentyn moved silently through the trees, making his way towards the soft babbling sound of a nearby stream. As he walked, taking in the sights of the early songbirds swooping and diving for food, seeing an early hare streaking through the ferns, hearing the strange whooping bray of a distant herd of zebra greeting the sunrise, he realized just how happy it all made him. No, more than happy, it was deeper than that. Happiness was quick and fleeting, here one minute and gone the next. This was more peaceful, more lasting, something deep in his bones he couldn't quite put a word through. He breathed in deeply and let it out in a satisfied sigh. Reaching the stream, he sat down on the bank in the crook of a tree root and watched the water go by. Since his adventure into the great river a few days before, he wasn't sure he fancied a swim anytime soon, but he did enjoy the peacefulness of watching the stream running past him. The amber light of the early sun turned the foaming surface golden, and as he watched, he caught sight of fish blowing bubbles on the surface and saw a kingfisher diving down to catch a few. He sat up, suddenly, leaning away from the tree. Something was different. He stayed there for a moment, absolutely still, no longer looking around himself. Now he was looking within himself. Mentally, he patted himself down, feeling around his senses to see what had changed. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something within him did not feel as it usually did. And then he saw it. Plain as day, this morning, this moment, was the first time in as far back as he could remember when he hadn't felt angry. There was normally a roiling well of anger in him at all times, always half full and rising fast. Now it was like that well had been drained and stood there hollow and echoing. It was gone. Well, perhaps not gone. He could feel even now that it could easily fill back up at a moment. But it was the first time he could remember it being drained at all. And Plentyn liked it. Jumping to his feet, he set off back to their makeshift camp, keen to find Grandma and tell her the news. "Well, that is champion, my lad," said Grandma when Plentyn found her by the newly revived fire. She'd placed a kettle on it which was hissing gently with the promise of tea, and she had a small pan of porridge warming for the both of them. "I'm so pleased for you, Plentyn, I really am," the old woman said. "I knew this adventure of ours would bear some fruit, though I shall confess I hadn't expected it so soon." She poured him tea, and Plentyn told her about the two memories, fragments of memories really, that he'd had of his family. Her green eyes blazed as she smiled across the fire at him. "Ah," she said, nodding sagely, "well, that explains it. I've been on this earth longer than men have been counting, Plentyn, but let me tell you, I have never slept so soundly nor woken so contented as when I truly felt to my bones, that I was home and safe and loved. You had some memories of those moments brought back to you, my lad, and look at the power of good it did you. Now," she said, passing him a small bowl made of olive wood, "have yourself a nice gnaw on some porridge, I've just mixed in some honey, and you tell me more." They ate companionably, and Grandma listened as Plentyn excitedly told her about his memories of his family. As they talked, one of the words Grandma had used seemed to rise to the surface of his mind. Contented. He'd heard the word before, and he knew what it meant on paper, but he'd never really felt it before, not truly, or not that he could remember anyway. "It's like the happiest day I've ever had has decided to sit down next to me and share its lunch or something," he said, when he tried to explain the feeling to Grandma. He was having trouble putting it into words, but it was there and it felt real. Grandma's eyes twinkled. "You know, lad, that's not a bad notion," she said, "and it's a tricky one to describe, isn't it? That true feeling of contentment. It's like all the really good emotions all rolled up into one. It's like that feeling you get just after you've had a really good belly laugh, but longer somehow." She trailed off, but Plentyn could see exactly what she meant, and they chuckled sheepishly at each other. At that, Red stirred from her place on Plentyn's cloak and pulled herself blearily to her feet. "Morning?" she asked. "Morning," Grandma confirmed. "Foodstuffs?" asked Red, a hopeful tilt to her head. "Foodstuffs," confirmed Grandma once again, opening her palm to reveal a handful of nuts Plentyn hadn't even seen her pull out of her bag. Red danced across to Grandma and set off eating the treasured bounty with a joyful squeak. Hopper rose at this point and loped off into the nearby trees in search of his own food. Plentyn noted, though, that for a creature supposedly drawn here by the pursuit of ferns and moss, he did seem to stick to grass a great deal of the time, but he kept that observation to himself. "So, where do we head next?" asked the kangaroo on his return, his ears flicking playfully. "I think Grandma's the only one who knows that," said Plentyn. "Where did you have planned for us, Grandma?" "Oh, my lad," said the old woman, a veil of deep secrecy draping her voice. "Today we visit the deepest, darkest parts of the forest in search of some of its most invisible inhabitants." Plentyn was convinced she was making fun, but he was drawn in nonetheless. From her customary perch on his shoulder, Red leaned forward. "Mysterious?" she sent, her eyes wide open. "Mysterious indeed," agreed Plentyn. "She'll not tell us any more until she's led us where she has planned, though. It would only ruin her surprise." So the four of them set about packing up their camp. Once everyone was on their feet and ready to go, Grandma took the lead, her long braids flowing behind her as she turned. "Follow me!" she cried, and marched off before them. The others trailed behind her, chatting back and forth. Red seemed to have decided Hopper was not so bad after all, now that she knew he wasn't after her supply of nuts and acorns. As Grandma had promised, though, they were walking deep into the forest, and after a few hours of walking, their conversation dried up. After a few more hours, Plentyn's feet were starting to ache, and his patience for Grandma's mystery was beginning to wear thin. He was painfully aware that his well of anger, while by no means full, was also no longer as empty as it had been that morning. He tried desperately to hold on to that feeling of contentment he'd had earlier, but it slipped away from him. He felt like he was trying to catch a butterfly with a thimble, and the more he swiped at it, the further away it got. Taking a deep breath and gritting his teeth, he concentrated on the walk, hoping they'd reach their mysterious destination before long. After another hour of walking, the sun now beginning to dip in the sky, Grandma called the group to a halt, and they gathered around her. The forest was thicker here, denser, and the air felt close about them. The trees and undergrowth blocked out the light, blocked out the sound, and the group instinctively drew closer to each other than they had in any other parts of the forest. "The place I have brought you to," said Grandma, her voice barely above a whisper, "is one few outside souls are permitted to see. The folk who dwell here are an ancient and noble race, and I've spent a great deal of time earning their trust. I would ask that you are respectful at all times, and whatever you do, do not mention," her voice dropped lower still, the barest hiss of a whisper, "cheese." "Cheese?" Plentyn began, but he was quickly cut off, Grandma's finger flying up and pressing against his lips. "Don't say it," she warned. "Just trust me, it's really better not." She said nothing else, instead turning to the tree that they were all gathered by, which Plentyn had assumed was the same as any other, though apparently he was wrong. She rapped smartly on the trunk, rack-a-tack-tack, and they all waited silently. Red leaned forward, her mouth open, breath held. Hopper's long ears swiveled. Silence. "Who seeks entrance?" came ascending through the quiet. The tone was sharp, tight, and filled with authority. "I am the one you know as Matsamilia," said Grandma, "known to some others as Makosh, she who speaks for the trees and for the earth and for all the creatures dwelling therein." Plentyn had never heard her speak this way before, with a sense of ritual. He'd never heard the name she was mentioning either, and he assumed this must be how she was known to whatever creatures they were visiting. With all this ceremony, coupled in with Grandma's mysterious tone from before, Plentyn was on tenterhooks. He felt a tightness in his throat and realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out in a steady stream, scanning the gloom to try and see what might happen next. "Passage granted," came the sending again, and to Plentyn's amazement, the trunk of the tree seemed to split down the centre, gaping forwards in a wide, open door. Plentyn could barely see inside, his eyes straining in the darkness. Wordlessly, Grandma strode forward into the opening, beckoning for the rest to follow. Hesitantly, Plentyn took another deep breath and walked on behind. Inside the tree, and Plentyn barely had time to register just how strange that thought was, he could see next to nothing. Through the thin, hazy light that streamed anemically behind them, he just caught sight of a small shape in the shadows to his right, and eyes reflecting pinpricks of daylight. Thud! The door shut fast behind them, and darkness reigned. "Keep walking," said the same voice as before. "Ground drops, gentle slope, no danger." Lacking any other options, Plentyn was forced to follow the instructions, though he felt if Grandma had not been walking ahead of him, humming gently to herself, then he would have stood stock still and refused to move a single step more. As it was, though, the instructions turned out to be accurate, and the ground sloped gently before them. Taking small, stumbling steps in the darkness, Plentyn had no idea how far they had walked. He guessed they'd been there for 5 or 10 minutes, but in the pitch black, his ears straining at every sound, time seemed to stretch and snap weirdly. For all he knew, it could have been 30 seconds or an hour. He could hear Red shifting about nervously. "Don't like," she sent. Plentyn wanted to offer some words of comfort, but her feelings seemed to match his perfectly. Behind him, he could hear Hopper shifting hesitantly forward, and he hoped the passageway they were in was suitable for his leaping strides. "Are you doing okay, Hop?" he began to ask. "Please, no talk," came the voice again, cutting him off. "Almost there." So, Plentyn continued to walk, hands stretched out before him, hoping he would not fall. After some time longer, Plentyn could not say how long, the ground beneath them levelled out, and the feel of the space around them changed. They had clearly left the tunnel, and the air felt cooler and fresher around them. From the way his footsteps echoed, Plentyn fancied they were in a large space, and he could hear soft rustling from all around. "Welcome, my friends," came another sending, a different voice this time, deeper, richer, older, and far, far warmer. "I apologize for the theatrics. We do not receive outsiders often, and you are not accustomed to our ways." "Never mind the explanations, Dedushka," came the impatient tones of Grandma. "How about you rectify the situation and give a little light to my friends after I brought them so far to meet you?" "But of course," came the voice, now known as Dedushka, expansively. There was a high squeaking sound, followed by the crackling hiss of a flame bursting into light. It was only a small flame, but after the darkness of the passage it felt like an assault on Plentyn's eyes. "Bright!" squawked Red on his shoulder, burying her face in his neck. Plentyn brought his own hands up in front of his face, squinting against the glare. As his eyes recovered, though, he blinked around the space to see their mysterious hosts at long last. They were in a deep, wide hollow that was almost perfectly round. Plentyn guessed they must be in the basin beneath several trees because the walls and ceilings above them were covered in creeping tree roots, like pale, twisting vines against the darkness of the earth. Every one of the roots around them was covered in small, furry shapes, their dark eyes glinting pinpricks of light back at him. Plentyn felt like he was in the middle of a great stadium surrounded by distant spectators. Except these spectators weren't distant. They were small, extremely small. All around them, the entire chamber was filled from floor to ceiling with mice. The tiny creatures seemed to be all ages and species brought together based on their sizes. Plentyn could see the grey shapes of house mice, the white-bellied shapes of deer mice, and the tiny shapes of harvest mice. In the centre of the space, Plentyn, Hopper, and Grandma must have seemed like hulking giants. Even Red seemed huge compared to the tiny faces before them. In the back of his mind, Plentyn was aware of sendings, lots of sendings. He realised that all the mice, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, were sending at the same time. It was strange and overwhelming, like the roaring of a crowd, a constant thought interrupting his mind, but he couldn't make out the words. "It's all right, lad," came Grandma's voice by his side. "It can be overwhelming at first when you don't know how to channel it." She laid a comforting hand on his arm. "Take a deep breath and focus on your own thoughts for a moment." Plentyn tried, but he didn't really know how. There was just a swirling mass of noise in his mind that he didn't know how to silence. He felt anger bubbling up inside him, and he tried to put his mental fingers in his mental ears, but with no success. "Oh my goodness," Grandma cried out. "There's a purple ostrich doing yoga up a tree." Plentyn's head whipped round to look at her, frustrated confusion twisting his face, his mind suddenly filled with the strange image of a purple ostrich stretching and nothing else. Blessed relief! The strange thought had muted the masses of tiny minds around them. He felt a grin spread across his face and saw a matching one from Grandma. "It doesn't matter what you think of," she told him. "It just matters that you find a thought that's all your own and you hold on to it. You'll get used to it after a while." "Thank you," said Plentyn. "It's what I'm here for," said Grandma. "Now, open your mind a little. Dedushka is talking." Plentyn scanned the room quickly and saw an older, larger mouse had stepped forward, its little paws raised before it. He tuned his mental hearing to pick up what the mouse was sending. "We welcome you to the Great Hall of the Mice," came the sending. "Matt Zemilia, of course, is known to us, but we welcome Brother Kangaroo, Sister Squirrel, and the young traveller Plentyn." Plentyn heard rustling and squeaks around the chamber as hundreds of mice leaned forward to see their guests. Once again, he felt the press of thousands of sendings, and once again, he marshalled his mind to block them out. "Thank you, Didushka," said Grandma. "We are honoured to visit your hallowed halls. We come to hear your stories if you have them to share." "If we have them to share?" asked the big mouse expansively, turning to address the whole room. "You ask if we have stories to share?" Plentyn felt that he was in the presence of a master storyteller warming up his crowd. There was a bold and playful tone to his sending, and all the mice seemed fixed on him, drinking in his words. "We, who are known as vermin?" Around the room, the mice let out a squeak as one, like a tiny cheer of affirmation. "We, who are hunted?" Another squeaking cheer. "We, who are trapped?" A third cheer. "The smallest, the weakest, the most brave?" It seemed like the old mouse's warm-up was building to a crescendo, and all the creatures knew it. This was clearly how they thought of themselves, renegade outlaws banding together against all who meant them harm. "Yes, yes," roared the mouse into the cavern. "We have stories to share, and such stories they are." The crowd gave another squeak of agreement, and Plentyn found himself smiling. There was a heady feeling of togetherness and unity, 1,000 souls joined together in a common purpose. It was intoxicating. "What would you have us tell you stories of, huh?" the old mouse asked. "Tales of daring, tales of adventure, tales of love and romance?" he asked, drawing out the last word. "We have them all, as you know." "How about tales of kindness?" asked Grandma. "Ah," said Didushka, nodding his old head slowly. "I know just the story. You," he paused for effect, "need the tale of Ripishki." Plentyn had never heard the name before, but clearly he was in the minority. The mice gathered on the roots around the chamber had heard the tale, and evidently it was a favourite. The tiny figures squeaked and twitched, not as one this time, but in a wild, raucous roar of delight. Through the crazy haze of sendings around the hall, Plentyn could hear them all repeating the name to each other. "Ripishki! The tale of Ripishki! Ripishki the Great! Ripishki the Hero!" The crowd went on and on, their passion never ceasing. "These guys are brilliant," sent Hopper from beside him, and Plentyn couldn't help but agree. On his shoulder, Red's head was pivoting around, her eyes and mouth wide, taking in the sight with awe. From the centre of the cavern, the small shape of Didushka raised his paws, palm pads outwards in a gesture of supplication. Gradually the crowd quieted, and the chamber drew silent. Around him, Plentyn became aware of all the mice settling back on their haunches, getting comfortable to listen. Grandma dropped to the ground, sitting smoothly despite her age, and Plentyn followed her example, sitting on the bare earth and crossing his legs before him. Red scrabbled down from his shoulder and perched on his knee, as if to get closer to the action. Hopper sat back too, his long feet and tail stretched forward, his eyes fixed on the tiny figure of Didushka as he addressed the crowd. "Let me tell you a tale," he began. And Plentyn listened. Thanks for listening. Tales from the Old Forest was a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Adventure is Calling by Vens Adams. Outro music was Conquest of Paradise by Simon Folwar. It was a Parable Arts production.